mute.
Audio check.
Afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here in a second. I think we'll get going. Glad to have everyone back today, and if you're joining us for the first time, appreciate it. Today's going to be the last in this series of 3 webinars where we're looking at information that's going to help us chart a sustainable future for our hatchery system. So just a little background. There's 3 factors that really led to this review kind of reach a tipping point with our system. One being some of the rising costs that we're seeing on landscape for fish food, personnel, maintenance, etc. Another being the deferred maintenance backlog that we have, which is pretty substantial, and you hear more about that today. And the third being some of the challenges from a changing climate, so more fire, increasing stream temperatures and decreasing flows, among others. So because of that, we're taking a step back and looking at the system as a whole and really asking the question, what makes sense to invest in going forward? We were fortunate last year that the legislature invested $1 million in this look, and so we've been able to contract with several folks outside of the agency to really gather a lot of information that's going to help us make these decisions going forward. So in these webinars, we're sharing the information with you. Oftentimes, we're getting the information, in some cases, a day ahead of these webinars. So we're really scrambling to put it together in a way that makes sense, that we can share. And so I just want to remind folks that because of that timeline, we often haven't had a chance to go back with the contractors and ask some questions about what they're sharing. And so it could be that between now and the final reports coming out later this month, there are some things that change. For example, last week we shared information on the economic benefits, and we had some questions around the way some of those benefits were calculated at a Wizard Falls, for example, where they were looking at fingerling fish versus a larger size fish release. So while we expect some of the details to change, the big picture likely isn't going to change. And we hope to have those final reports posted for you pretty soon here. And then also I just want to let you know that we've had some questions about posting the PowerPoints, and we do intend to get those up. Just our team here has been running full steam, hasn't had a chance to get that done, but do intend to get those up here soon. So I'm going to dive in here, and there will be time for questions at the end. There's going to be a lot of information. Just try and go through it at a decent pace, but we're happy to go back to it at the end if you need to revisit some of it. So through this review, we've been collecting different types of information. One of them has been about the economics, so the financial sustainability of the system, the costs and benefits and different funding models. And you saw a lot of that information in the last webinar. Another piece of information that's important is the climate vulnerability. So what are the impacts we're currently seeing and expect to see, and how might those impacts be mitigated? That's a lot of the information you're going to see today. And then also documenting the current state of the system. So what are the deferred maintenance needs of all these facilities? And again, that's something you're going to see today. The focus for us right now, we are looking statewide at all 33 facilities, which includes 14 state-owned and the remainder federal, or in the case of Round Butte, PGE. But for the focus here for these webinars is really on the state system. So the 14 red dots here, and then there's actually 3 federally owned facilities that we're bringing into this because we think those facilities can play a key role in supporting the state system. So those are Leeburg, South Santiam on the Willamette, and then Coal Rivers down the road. So I mentioned the series. August 1, we talked about the future need for hatchery programs, and that was really looking at the need at the species management unit scale, so a really large scale, think Oregon coast, Lower Columbia, Middle Columbia, Rogue, and South Coast kind of area. Last week, we heard about the economic cost benefits, a lot of information there around the costs of the different facilities and programs, as well as the benefits that are accruing from those. Then we also heard about some of the impacts that an assessment from OSU and NOAA is seeing on the viability of the hatchery stocks themselves going forward. Today, we're really going to dive into the infrastructure itself, looking at deferred maintenance, vulnerabilities, mitigation measures, and some alternatives. Then we're going to finish by talking about some of the planning and policy context for management of the hatchery system, which is important to keep in mind as we build tomorrow's system. And I do just want to mention, I think we had a few questions come in after the last webinar on the economics. So I thought I'd just cover them here with everyone so everyone's getting the same information. There was a few questions around how they distinguish between fishery benefits accruing to the hatchery system when there's a mixed hatchery wild fishery. And it's really the economists in that case were using the benefits derived from the harvest of hatchery fish alone. So it doesn't account for the benefits accruing from the wild fish component of that fishery. So for each hatchery fish harvested, they calculate out the benefits accruing from that. And they also make some assumptions about people that were fishing for hatchery fish but didn't actually catch them, which was a lot of cases my experience. So it's really focused on the hatchery fish side of things. And that's so the numbers don't reflect the broader fishery benefits that are accruing to the state from the mixed hatchery and wild fisheries. It was also really focused on Oregon and benefits accruing to Oregon. So we know, for example, that some of our fall Chinook, or a lot of our fall Chinook, are going up into Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska and getting caught there. And those economic benefits are accruing to other states, and they're not represented in the numbers that we shared last week. So it's not capturing everything, it's really trying to capture the benefits in Oregon. So with that, we're going to dive into the report that was prepared by Linka. This is a firm that we also contracted with to look at 6 facilities a couple of years ago and really kind of identify some of the hazards for us there. First thing we're going to talk about is the climate hazards and hatchery resilience for each of our state facilities and those 3 federal ones we talked about. So when Linka was looking at climate resilience, there was three kind of buckets of factors that they looked at. One being water availability. So one, what's the water right at those facilities, and what's the natural flows at those facilities. So our ability to access that water. We might have a water right for 10,000 CFS, but the natural flows may only be 7,000 CFS. So they looked at what the availability, both legally and in practicality, is at these facilities. Another thing they looked at was a whole range of water quality measures, several around temperature, also looking at pathogens, probability of flooding, and a host of other factors. Then they also brought in this other hazards category, which you can think of things like fire, sea level rise, greenhouse gases, etc. And then they put these factors together in a scoring matrix and compared the resilience of each facility under 3 scenarios. One scenario where they really weighted water availability heavily, another where they weighted water quality heavily, and a third where they weighted each of these 3 buckets evenly. And the reason there is that water availability and water quality really drive our ability to produce a quality product. So they're quite important. I'm just going to give you an example for flow and temperature and fire of some of the data that went into their analysis. So this is some data from North Nehalem, the hatchery up there. And the take home here is that the data is indicating that North Nehalem is generally going to be okay for available water, but there is some increased risk during summer. So I'll just step through what these graphs are showing. So the dashed line up top, I'm not sure if you can see the cursor, but up here at just above 10,000 gallons per minute, that's the water right that ODFW holds for that facility. So we're legally able to draw up to a little over 10,000 gallons per minute. The actual amount of water we're drawing is in this brown line at the top here. And the reason we're not drawing the full water right is because the stream flow just isn't sufficient to draw that full water right. So we're only actually able to draw, for example, a little over 6,000 in January, close to 10,000 in March, but then in summer, so July, there's really only around 4,000 gallons per minute available there. So think of that as kind of what's available to us. And then this blue line and the blue shaded area is what we would need as a minimum amount of water to rear the number of fish that we're currently rearing there. It's not the amount of water that we would need to produce a really high quality smolt, but it's the amount of water that we could, if necessary, is able to sustain the production. And so you're seeing that in these winter months, there's a lot of kind of excess water, which allows us to produce have high water quality and produce good quality smolts. In the summer time, in July, for example, you're getting pretty close to just being able to meet that minimum water demand. And then if you look forward into these kind of mid-century climate projections, that period where the minimum water demand and the actual water available is getting really close for a couple of months, July and August. And so you're going to have that little bit longer period where you're just kind of skating by. Contrast that with the next facility, LC. And so here you're seeing that already this is kind of historical on the top and then mid-century projections on the bottom. At LC currently, in that June-ish, kind of May-June period, already the amount of water we're able to draw out of the stream is lower than what the minimum water demand to maintain that production is. And it's the same in October. And then when you project forward, you're seeing that really period where there's not enough water extend from May through to October. So talking a bit about peak temperatures. So what are quantities? Obviously a big one. Do you have enough water to run the hatchery? Water quality is also another really big factor in our ability to produce quality products. Peak temperatures here, so think of these as kind of a good guide about whether the water is just too hot to rear fish. And there's some other factors we're going to talk about here in a second. So when we got a couple of bars here, the orange bar between 60 and 68, when you're in a hatchery facility, because the fish are at high density, when you're getting above 60 degrees, you're starting to see some issues. It's not particularly problematic, but you are seeing some issues with potentially increased disease or reduced growth. When you're getting above 68 for prolonged periods of time, that's when you really have some serious issues. And so these triangles that you're seeing on the graph here for each hatchery facility is the lower triangle is the actual temperature, peak temperatures that we measured in 2016, 2017, or some period between 2019 and 22. So this is data that was collected at the hatchery facilities. Then you've got an arrow that, triangle that's sometimes on top there, and that's the projected temperatures going forward. So in a lot of cases you're seeing, or we're expecting to see, that temperature, peak temperature is going to rise at a lot of our facilities. The take home really from this graph is that the hatcheries on the left are largely resilient. Temperatures there are currently in a good place and not projected to get too much hotter. But as you move to the right, we've already got 5 odd facilities there, Elk River, Alcina, Halem Salmon, and Rock Creek, that are in that zone where peak temperatures are really high and projected to get higher. And then you've kind of got this mix in between. And I should also point out that the federal facilities, South Santiam, Cole, and Leeburg, are just highlighted in red here. And just to orient yourself for all the remaining graphs. So generally, the hatcheries that are performing or having higher scores are going to be on the left side of these graphs, and the hatcheries with lower scores are going to be on the right. So in addition to peak temperatures, it's also important to think about the low side of temperature. So this is an example, again, from LC, where you're seeing the minimum temperatures exceed that 60-degree period for a period of 6 days in August. And fish can generally adapt to high temperatures if they're not experiencing them for a long time. But if there's no chance for them to recover, if there's no kind of drop in temperature or place they can go for a prolonged period of time, that's where you can really start to see some problems. And so we're looking at both the highs and the lows of temperature here. going to talk a bit about fire risk. So Linker used some of the recent fire probability maps to look at the fire risk around each hatchery. This is an example from LC. You see on the left panel some light colors around the hatchery, which indicating a pretty low fire risk currently. Shifting forward, kind of mid-century again, and that fire risk is increasing substantially. So darker colors mean more risk. But then you contrast that with a facility like Rock Creek, already on the left, a pretty high fire risk. And obviously we've seen some of the impacts of that. But then looking forward again, mid-century, that risk is getting even higher, with a lot of really dark colors there. I would say in general, what Linko found was that the fire risk is increasing at all our hatcheries, but some locations are going to be at very high risk. So when you put all that information together, the water availability, water quality, and these other hazards, and look at kind of where each hatchery falls out. Again, a higher scoring, more resilient hatcheries are on the left, the lower scoring, less resilient hatcheries are on the right. And the federal hatcheries are just labeled in red here. So for example, South Santiam, Wizard Falls, Fall River, Klamath, they're all coming out very resilient. And you can see the different components that are contributing to that in the different colors there. So water availability, that component of the overall resilience is in the light blue at the bottom. Water availability is in the greenish colors in the middle, and then the other hazards, fire, etc., sea level rise are in the orange at top. Just pause there for a second. Now we're going to dive into looking at an analysis Linka did on the infrastructure itself, so deferred maintenance, and then system considerations. So just as they did with the climate vulnerability, they looked at three kind of buckets of things. One being deferred maintenance. So they were looking at what costs would be to address existing issues. But it's also important to keep in mind that it's not just building it back to what it was, it's building it to a level that we would need to address future risks. A lot of this was work that was done by another contractor called QRS Engineering, and that information was fed into Linka's analysis. The second bucket that they looked at was these projected modifications. And these are really to address special circumstances. So some examples are Lieberg, where we know we're going to lose the water supply to that facility when Lieberg Dam comes out in 8 or 9 years. And so there's going to need to be some work done there to address that circumstance. Similarly, Rock Creek, that facility currently has been destroyed by the fire, so there would need to be a lot of work done there. And then the third thing they looked at was these climate and technology upgrades. So these are things like chilling, recirculation, shading, in some cases, alternative energy sources. So those are the three kind of buckets they looked at. Within each of those buckets, there was a host of factors. And when you plot that out, again, the lower cost hatcheries are on the left, the higher cost hatcheries are on the right. And so Fall River, Wizard Falls, Nehalem, infrastructure costs within those buckets are on the order of 2 to 7 or 8 million. Contrast that with some of the work at Lieberg, Coal Rivers, and Rock Creek, and you're talking about 25 to 45 million. There's some range around that, obviously. Coal Rivers, a lot of that work is already ongoing and being funded by the federal government. Lieberg, that's work we're going to have to do with the Corps of Engineers. But Rock Creek is a state facility, and that's something we're considering here right now. So again, those costs are broken out by the different categories. So we've got the annual operating costs on the bottom, which are a pretty minor part of this. Got deferred maintenance in that kind of light green. And then project modifications, those are those special categories I mentioned in the darker green. And then the climate technology, the chilling, recirculation, etc., in the blue. So just pause on that for a second. So a third analysis that Linker did was looking at the contribution of each facility to the hatchery system. this is kind of a hard one to describe really what it is, but they looked at three buckets again. One being fish production, so simply how much biomass and fish is being produced at a facility. Second, they looked at was the potential additional capacity. So understanding, was there undeveloped space at a facility where you could potentially put more raceways, or was there available water that you could use if you spent some money to develop that resource? And then they also looked at this kind of catch-all bucket for connectivity, community, and something else that I forgot to write, which is really looking at how connected that hatchery is to other hatcheries in the system. So for example, think like Coal Rivers, that facility, about 80% of production in the Southwest passes through Coal Rivers at some point. It's connected to the Umpqua, Coos Bay, the Coquille, Chetco. So it's really connected to the entire Southwest, whereas some facilities are really self-contained and fish don't move off-site or come on-site from other facilities. They looked at social factors. So are these facilities in areas that are underserved or whether, underserved. They looked at whether these facilities are producing programs that are in response to policy obligations, so Pacific Salmon Treaty or other kind of agreements like that. And then they compared the system, what we're calling the system contribution of a facility under three scenarios. So one where it really emphasized the importance of that additional capacity, and one where it emphasized the importance of that connectivity and community, and one where there was equal weights applied to all three. And so when you plot that out, again, the facilities that are more linked into or more critical to the system operation as a whole, or have more excess capacity, plot out on the left side of this graph, and the ones that are less connected or have less capacity plot out on the right. And you see that you really have to pay attention to the different colors in this graph. For example, Leeburg, a lot of additional capacity, but it's not so connected to the rest of the system. Whereas, for example, Roaring River, not so much excess capacity, but is really connected. So those trout from Roaring River are going to a lot of places, a lot of other hatcheries. So there's a lot to dive into in assessing the data in this graph, but generally think of, if it's on the left, there's a lot of connection and contribution to the hatchery system. And then this graph just ties all those three prior assessments together and looks at infrastructure costs, system contribution, and climate resilience. Again, climate resilience on the bottom in that kind of brown color. System contribution, the one we just saw now, is in the yellow, and then the infrastructure costs, so deferred maintenance, upgrades, project modifications are in the blue on top. And so when you combine all that, again, just thinking on the left side of the graph, these are hatcheries that are scoring higher, lower vulnerability, some of the lower costs, although not always, and higher kind of system contribution. So I'll just pause on this one for a while. Okay. So another thing we asked Lincoln to do was to compare some alternative system configurations. We wanted to understand how, what the total cost of investing in all these facilities was. So the 14 state facilities versus another model where we potentially consolidate productions into fewer facilities and have more of a kind of a hub approach. So in this, Linker analyzed alternative one, which is upgrades at all existing facilities. So it's essentially some of the costs you've just seen at each of those facilities. And then some alternatives. For the Southwest, The alternative was the same in each of these, was closing Rock Creek, expanding Bandon and Elk, and that relies on some investments at Coal Rivers on the federal side. In the Northwest, the alternatives varied. So alternative 2A, they looked at closing the Halem and then upgrading Cedar and LC to accommodate some additional production. In 2B, they looked at closing Salmon River and upgrading Cedar and the Halem to accommodate additional production. And in 2C, closing LC and upgrading Cedar and the Halem for additional production. In the Deschutes, they looked at upgrading Oak Springs and Fall River and all options. And that's because those facilities, we would potentially move trout into those facilities to free up space on the west side for some of the production coming out of some of those closed facilities. And the images up top, you'll see them in the reports at a larger scale. That's just showing how the production could shift around under some of these scenarios. So on the left, there's an image of alternative 1, which is kind of the current. And on the right, you'll see there's that's where LC's closed. You've got additional production going to Cedar and the Halem, so those circles get a little bigger. And down south, you've got Rock Creek being closed and some expanded production into Bandon and Elk. So when you compare the capital costs for these alternatives, so just what the construction costs would be to implement these, alternative 1, you're looking at, so that's investing in all 14 state facilities. It's on the order of 220 odd million. There's a range there. So the range goes from about 160 up to about 280. When you look at alternatives 2A through 2C, the total costs are slightly lower. The range is still pretty high there in estimating some of those capital costs. And then just so you can kind of orient yourselves in the little inset there on the top right, that's comparing the cost savings relative of each of those alternatives relative to option 1. So for 2A, you're saving on the order of 7 or 8 million capital costs. 2B, it's around 9 million, and 2C, it's a little over 16 or 17 million, with the orange bar there representing the range of potential savings. So that kind of finishes off at a high level the analyses Linker have been doing. There's a lot more in their report that we're all going to see, and hopefully we'll get that again posted on the website later this month. So we're going to switch gears and talk a bit about the policy and planning context. So as we move forward with the system of tomorrow, this is the context we need to keep in mind. It's going to provide the sideboards for what programs are being produced at these facilities in the future. This was an analysis that was done by Four Peaks, and it's really addressing what the budget note asked, which was a summary of how the ecological impacts and benefits of hatchery programs on wild fish are incorporated into federal and state policy and planning making. So in the Four Peaks report, they acknowledge that fish provide significant social, cultural, hatchery fish provide these significant social, cultural, economic, and conservation benefits. And some of those we've talked about in the previous webinars. Some are going to come out in our discussions with you all and with the tribes. But they also acknowledged in the report that hatcheries and hatchery fish can have ecological, genetic, and environmental impacts. And I think this is something we're also all familiar with. The key thing in the report was really outlining this policy and planning framework and how it utilizes best available science to ensure that hatchery fish are good neighbors to wild fish. Some of those, that framework is really exists on the federal side and the state side. So on the federal side, there's the Endangered Species Act, there's biological opinions and HGMPs, hatchery genetic management plans. On the state side, we've got the wildlife policy, which is in statute. We've got the native fish conservation policy, climate and ocean change policy, hatchery management policy, and the fish health management policy, which are all adopted policies by the Commission. And then we've got various conservation and management plans like the Coastal Multi-Species Plan or the Rogue South Coast Plan. And just generally, if you think at a higher level here, it's policy goals, kind of high-level statements about what you're trying to achieve. And as you move down the list, you're getting very specific about actions or targets or metrics you're going to try and achieve. And this, please don't try and read through the diagram on the right here. This is just to give you a flavor of what's in the report in terms of the process that is gone through to ensure that these hatchery programs are good neighbors to wild fish. So this is just an example of what an ESA consultation looks like for an hatchery genetic management plan development process, NEPA review, and ESA consultation. And the point here is really just to say that it's a very rigorous process that brings in the best available science to ensure that measures are being put in place, that these programs, the risks from these programs will be minimized. What that looks like on the ground is some of these mitigating measures. So you can break down the potential risks into ecological, genetic, and environmental. And these reviews, the ESA reviews and the state reviews, they're meant to ensure that these measures are in place to minimize these risks while achieving those program benefits. And so some of these measures include looking at the release timing. So how you timing the fish relative release timing so that they will move to the ocean quickly. The number of fish you're releasing, the size and condition of those fish. So are they ready to go out? Are they smolting? Are they of a size that they're not going to residualize? And then marking as well, so you can distinguish them. It's looking at broodstock selection. So are you using wild broodstock or are you using segregated broodstock? And how are you managing that overlap on the spawning grounds? It's also looking at the hatcheries themselves. And so is there adequate screening to keep fish out as they're migrating down? And is the hatchery meeting those water quality standards? These are just some of the measures. There's a whole lot more. So the take-homes from the 4 Peaks report are really that hatchery programs have benefits and risks, but there are policy and planning frameworks in place that achieve those benefits while minimizing the risks, and that there is a very thorough federal process to address risk in cases where you have listed stocks. And that I think here, as we're thinking about building the system for tomorrow, these sideboards are still going to govern those future programs, so they're important to keep in mind. I just want to end with a reminder to folks that we have a public meeting coming up on August 28th. You can go to our website to sign up for updates. Our web team did make some changes to the look of that website to hopefully make it easier for people to get the information they need. You can sign up there for updates. So anything we put out, you'll get an email so you can keep track of this. And with that, I'm going to stop and take any questions. Dean.
Thanks, Sean. I really appreciate the work you guys put into this. These webinars have been well put together, well thought out, and I think you've done a fantastic job explaining the challenges that we all face moving forward. So congratulate you on that and your team. I had a question about some of the programs that, because of mitigation, would be required, to the best of my knowledge, would be required to move forward, and where, you know, if Rock Creek is closed, for example, will the spring Chinook program end, or will there be the opportunity for it to be moved and continue out of Coal Rivers and what's left of this facility at Rock Creek? Similarly, the STEP program on the South Umpqua, and, you know, some of these other programs across the state that have, you know, requirements to continue producing hatchery fish. If those hatcheries are closed, has there been assessment done, or is that forthcoming on what hatchery is going to pick those up?
Yeah, there's so many moving parts to this. It just gets insanely complicated.
Yeah.
So when they looked at those alternatives, there was some assessment done of whether the programs in those basins could shift to other facilities and be reared. And I'd say generally yes, but there are some caveats that if you're going to maintain a program in a basin, you still need a way to collect broodstock, and you need a place to acclimate them. So So you potentially still need some infrastructure in those basins, and specifically the spring Chinook program in the Aqua would be challenging because you'd need to be able to have a way to collect those fish and acclimate them. And currently it's challenging to get them to turn up to Rock Creek. So I say, yes, there has been some work done, and that's something we could dive into more if needed, but I think it's also something that the small groups are going to have to wrestle with is what does that look like?
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yeah, I was hoping to go back to that alternative slide and look at, as you talk about keeping the current capacity in the system and how you consolidate that production. And I think it goes to maybe Dean's question too. I was just curious on that slide because I couldn't really see the differences or any changes in species. And again, if you're going to consolidate production, I think it goes to Dean's question is, does that mean continuing the same production as today and Coho, Chinook in the various, so I'm just trying to understand that a little bit better, and maybe you can elaborate more on that screen because there was a lot to it that I couldn't really see based on those circles.
Yeah, I acknowledge it's tough to see on there. Linker does have larger maps for each of those alternatives, but even there it's hard to tease out because essentially what you're looking at is a shift of like 200,000 full Chinook out of salmon to another facility, and that 200,000 is really hard to pick out of a pie. But when our staff were looking at when, if we were to consolidate, it was not with the idea that you would be eliminating the program itself. It'd be move that program for rearing at another facility. And so there you still need a way to collect and acclimate fish, kind of as I was saying to Dean. So it's not looking at eliminating those programs. It is just looking to move them to another facility. And that's part of where you see the investments in Fall River and Oak Springs, because you're moving trout out of the valley, for example, or some of these coastal facilities over there, and freeing up space on the west side for rearing some of these anadromous programs. So it's a complicated shuffle that there's so many different iterations that you could analyze. I think we're just going to have to go into this kind of small group discussion about, these are kind of the big levers we could pull. And I think we could probably, if we want to maintain the same programs, there are ways to do that generally. Some may cost more or less than others. Or you could potentially think about what a different program would look like, or a program at a different place. So there's just a lot of alternatives that we could run through here. And I think we're going to have to do a bit of that in the small groups.
No, thanks. I appreciate that.
Steve.
Hi, Sean, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. I live on the Umpqua River. I'm quite familiar with the fishing regulations we live under here, and the spring Chinook season is up and down the river from, well, the whole river this year is limited to hatchery fish. So if you were to shut down hatchery spring Chinook, and things were to continue the way they are, you'd basically be shutting down that whole fishery on the river. And that would be certainly concerning to anybody in the community that fishes for springers on the Umpqua. Likely also affected would be winter steelhead, because there are winter steelhead hatchery fish that we're allowed to catch here, but that's all we're allowed to keep. So that would, I don't know if it would affect winter steelhead as well, but I know you did speak to spring Chinook. I just thought I'd let you know that would be quite a blow to fishermen on the Umpqua River. And then just wanted to make the comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. It's point well taken. The winter steelhead program isn't as much of an issue because we can still collect brood for that, and it could be reared elsewhere. The spring Chinook program's the challenging one because we're largely collecting those at both Winchester Dam and Rock Creek. And as Rock Creek is heating up, it's just really challenging to get those fish to turn back into Rock Creek. And Rock Creek is a location itself, like you've seen through these webinars, that there's some really significant challenges there in terms of temperature, flow, and fire, and other. It's just going to be very costly. So that's one we're going to have to talk a lot about, I think.
And Sean, there is a question in the chat. I can read it to you if you want, or you can look at it.
Let me go there. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so James was asking if the Pacific Salmon Treaty obligates us to produce at certain facilities or just meet certain production levels. I don't know the answer about obligated at certain facilities. It's more, I'm pretty sure no, but the issue is at Salmon River, it's an indicator stock. So we released 200,000 full Chinook and they're coded wire tagged. And that the catches of those fish in the ocean fisheries is used as an indicator for the entire northwest of Oregon. And that's the obligation to the PST, that we have that ability to indicate what impacts are. And so there'd have to be a period where you're shifting that indicator stock to something else. And that's something that's got to be unraveled here. So I don't think we have to produce them at certain facilities, but we do have to have an indicator. And currently that indicator is at Salmon River. Liz.
Yeah, so when you're talking about raising fish in different hatcheries, are you concerned about potentially increasing straying rates, even if you are doing some acclimation?
Certainly that's a consideration. I will say there's a lot of movement already in the system, and I'm not sure this would be looking at a whole lot more movement, or certainly not an order of magnitude greater movement. And I think a lot of the research that has been done indicates that, you know, if we're acclimating them for a sufficient period of time, that stray rate is really minimized. And there is some pretty good ongoing research in the Umpqua, for example, on the winter steelhead that's showing, looking at days versus weeks and different time periods there and showing some pretty good results. So I guess a consideration, but also I think there are ways that we can manage around that. I mean, there's going to be trade-offs to all of these approaches. More facilities you have, that's more facilities to maintain. More facilities are particularly in the line of fire. The fewer facilities you have, you've got to move more fish around. If you lose one of those facilities, you're kind of at more risk. So there's a lot of trade-offs we're going to have to think about as we build this system for tomorrow. Steve again.
Yeah, one other question, Sean. The CMPs, which I participated in years ago for the Umpqua, and I know I think all of the rivers have their own CMP guidelines. I believe that from what we're talking about, the potential exists that all of those CMPs would be impacted by decisions made here.
Yeah, so the CMP, Coastal Multi-Species Plan, that kind of is the document that kind of sets sideboards on these hatchery programs from up north, kind of Astoria, down to Elk River. And I guess it may or it may not. It depends kind of where we land here. It could be that, the programs are just going to continue as is, but maybe the rearing location changes or release location changes, but it's still consistent with what's outlined in the CMP. Or Or it could be that through discussions with you all and with the tribes, we want to do something different. And in that case, yeah, it would need to be a modification to the CMP, potentially through the commission. Likely what's going to happen is that there's going to be a transition from where we are now to where we think we're going to be in the future. Keep in mind, like last week, for example, we saw some of the projections for some of the hatchery stocks themselves, and for some of steelhead, those projections are not looking great. So even though we have authorized programs through the CMP, are those the programs we want to keep investing in, or do we want to put that investment into a stock that's likely to do better in the future? It's not going to be something that happens overnight, but there's going to be a transition from now to 20, 30, 40 years from now. Just extending the awkward silence a little longer to see if anyone has questions. David.
Thanks, Sean. The focus on the state-owned system with 3 additions, South Santiam, Coal Rivers, and Leeburg. I'm wondering how, what do you envision the mechanism is in working with, and I think all 3 of those are Corps of Engineer facilities, and are they, I guess, what's the plan? Have you been investing time between your staff and their staff talking about this, or is it sort of, are we too early to kind of get into that?
We have had some early discussions with the Corps of Engineers, and we've been engaged with them pretty closely on Coal Rivers, for example, to make sure that that facility has the capacity to rear their mitigation, which if it does that, it will have the capacity to do some of the things that we would like to do as well, which would be using state funds, not federal funds. I'd say at Leeburg, it's really early days. The Corps will need to get a plan together for how they're going to deal with the removal of Leeburg Dam. But certainly we've had that conceptual discussion with them.
If I could have a follow-up.
Sure.
On Leeburg, was eWeb's sort of management plan priority considered by the consultants who looked at whether Leeburg does that factoring into whether it makes sense to be investing in Leeburg in the long term?
So the risk at Leeburg is removal of Leeburg Dam, but that risk can be mitigated through infrastructure adjustments. And so they looked at what the costs of those adjustments would be. That's in the projected modifications category that you see in there. So it's not like it's not something we can deal with. It's just a matter of whether that ends up being the best solution and there's funds available to execute it.
So you're saying that it is reflected in sort of the ranking in that you showed, briefly today.
Yeah, so the costs are in there, but then also it reflects the fact that there's a good supply of cold water in the Mackenzie. So some of the water quality, quantity, fire, climate risk, it's in the costs and it's in that connectedness.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Doug, I see online you were asking if we anticipate closures within the short term, 2 to 4 years, even though the grand plan might be 30, 40 years. I'd say we're not really anticipating anything at this point. Everything kind of is on the table. Our goal is not to come out of this with reduced production, but we are open to ideas about what the system looks like going forward. So we've got all this information that we're just getting now. Our staff haven't had time to digest it. We're going to be talking with you all, with the small groups and with the tribes. And based on all those discussions, we're going to develop a plan. And so until we're further through that process, I don't really feel confident saying one way or the other. As I think folks are aware, our agency recommended budget does propose defunding 2 facilities next biennium. Unrelated to this, but it's one of the factors that's feeding into the need for this, is that our agency budget just isn't able to keep pace with the rising costs. Hopefully that answers that. Okay, well, not hearing any more, we might go to wrapping this up. I do just want to give a shout out to Dan Straw, who I see online, our hatchery manager at Clackamas. Dan and his team had an eventful night earlier this week when the siphon pump failed. But you folks did a really good job of responding to that and keeping everything going. So I really appreciate it. And with that, I think we'll call this a wrap. Remember to check in again with us later this month. Keep checking the website for updates, sign up, and we hope to see you there. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.